I'll go ahead and get started. If people come, I'll just let them in here. Well, anyways, so last summer I went to Norway and Finland on my bicycle. And I guess like to start this, it sounds like it's like, oh, this great vacation and everything. But in actuality, like starting this trip, I was like extremely jet lagged, and the jet lag led to me like being super tired, and that led to me being really hungry and making really bad decisions and just like generally not being in a super great place. And then on top of that, shortly a few months before I left, my friends were murdered while riding their bikes. So overall, like the start of this trip was just like not a particularly good headspace for me. So I started in Bergen, which is down in the southwest in Norway. And this is like generally about as far north as anyone realistically ever goes in Norway, in Europe in general, really anywhere in the world. Bergen is the rainiest city in Europe. It gets almost 90 inches of rain a year. And for comparison, like San Francisco gets 20, and London, which is known as like a super rainy city, gets 23 inches of rain a year. So of course I'm in like this terrible headspace, and I'm in the rainiest city in Europe, and I get perfect weather the entire time I was around Bergen. So it's super sunny and beautiful and warm, and I'm just tired and hungry and cranky, and I keep riding to the end of these fjords and getting lost and turned around, and I was not super happy. So it is beautiful there. You should definitely go see the fjords in Norway. But if you're already in like maybe a kind of a low place mentally, this is not necessarily the place you want to get lost. So Norway has a lot of like public infrastructure projects because they have so much money, and they spend this money on like making the country a nicer place to live. So the picture that's on the right here, I was actually just standing in the middle of the road taking it. So Norway, I'll show you some pictures later, but they bear these tunnels through the mountains so that it's easier to drive through, ride your bike. But when there was a road there, they basically left that old road open for cyclists, and cars would go through the tunnel. So for like a 3-mile long fjord here, I was riding my bike on a road completely by myself, and the cars would just go through the tunnel and completely miss the like, if you can't get this view if you're in a car. Eventually I got to a town, and I decided to just kind of hit a reset on this whole thing. So I took the bus up to Trondheim, which is kind of like a university tech town in Norway. It's quite a bit farther north, but even though it's as far inland as it looks here, it's still saltwater because it's still on the fjord. They have a swim club in Trondheim. It wasn't open when I was there, just like hours wise. It was seasonally it was open, but they have like this big diving platform there, and they build a sauna there every year and kind of take it down at the end of the season. The water here was about like, this was mid to late May, and the water was like mid 40s. So it was still pretty chilly. They don't really get the warmest water of the year until August, September. So after it's had the whole summer to heat up. And then I'm a big fan of street signs. So these were, the one on the right is like a very common sign, basically like saying share the road. And all the share the road signs have cyclists on them, which is quite nice because the roads are pretty narrow. There's no shoulder on them at all. So even the main kind of highway type of roads were about 1.5 lanes wide, with a lot of trucks and campers and stuff, heavy winds that would kind of blow you off your bike a little bit. But I had no close calls. There was nothing wrong with this at all. And then the picture on the left is a sign. It's basically saying drive slowly, like this is a neighborhood street, but it's a picture of a kid getting hit by a car. And it literally translates to, we have no children to lose, drive carefully. And there were quite a few signs similar to this in the neighborhoods. So as I mentioned, Norway has a lot of money, which is from oil that they found offshore in the 70s, I think. So per capita, I believe, if it's not the wealthiest country in the world, it's pretty high up there. So they build these, all the road services are like perfect, which considering I was there in May and the winter was just ending, you'd expect the roads to be full of potholes and gravel and all sorts of stuff, but the road surfaces are redone like every year, and it was like immaculate pavement. So on the left, there's this tunnel bored through a hill, and this is probably only like 10 meters long. The tunnels aren't usually that long, but it's done to just kind of make it a flatter road. But because they're always going through these hills, anytime you go through a tunnel, the weather is different on the other side of the hill. So even if it's just 10 meters, like it might be, in this picture, you can see that it's sunny where I'm standing. It was raining on the other side about like 10, 15 meters away. And when it's pouring out, the tunnels are really nice because they're like a brief respite from the wind and the rain. But they are kind of cold and damp, and you don't really want to be lingering in there. On the right is a cycling escalator. So this is in Trondheim, and you may have seen like kind of famous pictures of the canals in Trondheim. And so the canals are obviously at sea level, and then a lot of the houses are at a higher level, and it's built on hills, but it's pretty common, especially for couriers, to be at kind of the commercial sea level and then having to go to these houses that are higher up. So this is like the main road that goes from the canal shop level to the houses. And it's definitely not the steepest road in the area, but it's very heavily trafficked by bikes. And basically what you do is you stand at the bottom and you press a button, and then you, like a little pedal comes up, and you put your foot on the pedal, and then the pedal continues up the hill, and you just make sure that your wheel stays pointed upwards, and it just drags you up the hill. And I thought, I'd heard about this before I went, and I thought maybe it was like a tourist trap type of thing, but it was almost all locals using it when I got there, like a lot of local couriers just carrying their goods up the hill. I did not try it because my bike was so heavily loaded that it was already hard to keep it handling straight, like on a good day, and I really didn't feel like wiping out in the middle of like popular tourist area. So once when I was in the rainiest city in Europe, I had perfect weather, but as soon as I left that area, it started raining a lot. And the section of this ride from Trondheim to Bergen, which is just the end of this section that I'm talking about now, you're riding past glaciers. It's on the coast, but it's kind of like inland. It's not, the Gulf Stream sits off the coast in Norway, but this is quite a ways like in from the Gulf Stream. So it's not super warm, but you're getting all the cold winds off the glaciers. You're getting the cold winds coming down from the north, and it's just like cold and mountainous and freezing. And you're also crossing, this is the section where you cross the Arctic Circle. So you're definitely getting north. So a lot of times it was raining, and I'd end up sleeping in these cabins, which you can just rent for the night. It's like fairly bare bones, just like a cot and a space heater, which is perfect because you can dry out your stuff, because riding in the rain is totally fine. It's already cold and wet. So the best thing you can do in the cold and wet is to keep moving and keep yourself warm. But when you want to sleep, the ground is boggy. You can't really pitch a tent because it's going to sink into 3 inches of water. You can't dry your stuff out because it's raining out. And it's kind of a pain, like camping and living in the rain. So I went to these cabins kind of like every other night or so, but they were really, really convenient. Okay. So the word maelstrom is Norwegian, and this is the strongest tidal current in the world. It's called the Saltström and Maelstrom. And basically, two fjords empty out twice a day. And the mouth of the fjord is only 150 meters wide. So all the water comes rushing through there. The Golden Gate Bridge, for example, or the Golden Gate as a counterpoint, is a bit over a mile wide, and that's considered like a pretty strong tidal current. This is only 150 meters. It empties more water, so the tides here routinely reach speeds of about 20 knots. They develop these big kettles in the water that could be like 15, 20 feet across. The fishing here is super, super good because it's a really narrow inlet, and everything just comes through there. So all the animals and fishermen and everyone just kind of hang out here and just eat everything. I saw a couple pods of dolphins here. There were tons of fishermen. Orcas are found here fairly often. And then I took the ferry. So the southernmost point here is Boda. And then I took the ferry northwest to the Loften Islands, which is this island chain on the west here. And the Loften Islands kind of sit like in the Gulf Stream. And because of that, and because of the heat that's brought north in the Gulf Stream, the Loften Islands are the northernmost place in the world that doesn't see freezing temperatures. So you can get here, there's still snow and everything, but you'd be maybe like 68 degrees north, which like in the United States, that's like deep into the heart of Alaska. And like you can still have, pretty moderate temperatures, like temperatures similar to closer to like New York City type of temperatures. So because they're out in the Gulf Stream, there's a lot of fishing. This is like a really, really productive fishing region. And because it's so far north, the tides are also just much bigger than we see like in San Francisco. So this is a kind of traditional fishing hut here. They're all over the coast. And this is at low tide, so there's no water, but you can see the high water mark on the rocks there. That flushes in and out twice a day. And the fishermen just live here, dry their fish here. There's like fish drying everywhere, basically. So these are racks of cod. Cod is the main fish that's caught here. And it's sort of like a local thing. A lot is sold for export to Italy. It's like a pretty dried cod is quite popular in Italy, I guess. But it comes from the Vikings when they were trying to load up their provisions for their journeys and needed food that wouldn't spoil at sea and last for a long time. So dried cod was kind of a staple in Viking travel, and they still fish a lot of cod here. So I met some cyclists that were riding south, and I think they were there more towards the beginning of the harvest. I was there near the end, so a lot of racks that I passed were already empty. But the two cyclists coming south said that they just met this like awful stench of cod the whole time. Like I definitely smelled the cod, but maybe I just don't mind it as much. Like I don't know. I had no issues with the smell of cod. Just to give an idea of how much fish there are on these racks, the picture on the left, there were some sheep hiding out under here to get out of the rain. It was still wet under there, but it was definitely like the best form of shelter for these sheep. And then I got to Loften. It's still like raining a bit, but my first 2 days in Loften were kind of like the end of the real rainy period. And you end up with these beaches up there that are like completely like perfect white sand, crystal clear blue water. And as you can see in this picture, but there's also like a storm of heavy clouds hanging over it. So the beaches here pretty much, this is like in early to mid-June or early June. So the beaches here are still empty. Like the water temperatures are still like mid 40s and it's raining, it's windy, no one's around. But if you can get past that, they're like perfect kind of Caribbean looking beaches. Absolutely stunning. Like the best beaches I've ever seen in my life are in northern Norway. So eventually the sun did come out and I feel like I should probably clarify that the sun has been up since I got to Norway. In Bergen, there was like maybe 3 hours of darkness a night. And I think that's actually what contributed to a lot of my jet lag, was the very short night. But having no night at all actually kind of got rid of that wake sleep trigger, and I was actually able to sleep a lot better. So up until this point, there was no real light out because it was so overcast and rainy, but the sun had never actually gone down. So this is a pretty popular surf beach in Lufton. You can, whoops. Okay. You can see on the right, there's sort of like a little house there, and there's a similar setup on the left side that's out of frame. And a lot of surfers come here for the season. They just bring their campers down and hang out in the parking lot for a while and like drive around, go do a little backcountry skiing, do some surfing, because in Norway you can do both all the time. And it doesn't really matter what time of day it is. So if the good surf comes in at like 2 a.m, the sun's still up, so you can go surf. Because I was just camping out without a camper van, I just set up in the middle of the beach and no one bothered me at all. And because the sun had just come out, I decided to take an extra day here, did a little hiking, found some sheep because it was lamb season, and there are sheep everywhere. Up until I hit reindeer country, there's sheep everywhere that I've been. Sometimes they chase you, sometimes they're curious, sometimes they don't care at all. Like the lamb on the right here is very curious about me and followed me, whereas his mom and his sibling do not care. They're just eating on the cliff here. So this was like 1 o'clock in the morning, I think. The surf was good, so everyone came out surfing. This particular beach held a surf contest a couple years ago, and several orcas joined the lineup, like pretty much right where these guys are. So that particular contest was canceled, but that just kind of gives you an idea of like how far out into the Gulf Stream this really is and how much fish is in the area. Like orcas literally just like hang out at the beach here. So then I rode out of that beach because everywhere you go, you have to go up and down a hill. It doesn't matter where you are. So when I would look at route profiles, I'd actually get really excited when there's something that looks like this, where it's like a sudden spike and it's really, really steep for a very short period, because that almost always means that there's a tunnel, and that means like you can avoid the steep bit entirely. When it looks like a road that is kind of steep, but like theoretically could be ridden, it often meant that there wasn't a tunnel, and those were definitely like the worst rides, and I'll get to one of those in a few slides. So when I was on the ferry I was on a lot of ferries just because you use them a lot to cross the fjords and stuff, but most are only like a couple minutes long. When I was on the ferry, one of the workers told me that he grew up in Lufton, and he told me that it was a good thing that I was there on my bicycle instead of a car. And he said the reason for that was that the islands, there's so much on these islands, and it changes in such a short physical area, or such a short physical distance, that doing it on a car, inside the car, and at the speed that a car can go, he's like, you would miss a lot. So these 4 pictures were all taken within about like 8 or 9 miles of each other, within a couple hours of each other. So I started on the lee side of the island and had to ride up into the mountains, through an alpine meadow, along the fjord, drop down onto the windward side of the islands, and then, which is where, like, why there's so much fog and everything in this bottom left picture. And then, so it's just like every day you're constantly going through different landscapes, different weather. Honestly, like the weather is so much a part of being in Norway that I think you could there are not many places I'd say someone could go do it like 5 times and get 5 completely different experiences, but that's definitely the case in Norway. Like every single time you would ride this, you'd get a very different view of it. Oops. So after the sun and the rain have like very different reactions. Like the rain drives you down, but you don't really remember it afterwards. You just get the sun on your skin and you're like, oh, life is wonderful. You kind of forget about the rain and the wind, and you just think this is a really wonderful place. So after about a week of sunshine, I came to this fjord and I was like, this is great. I'm just gonna set my tent here. And I only had maybe like a 30-mile ride to the next ferry. And I was like, great, tomorrow will be a nice, flat, easy day, no problem. I woke up the next morning with my tent on my face because there were steady 30-mile-per-hour winds gusting well over 40 miles an hour, which is gale force winds, like just kind of below hurricane level. And needless to say, that 30-mile ride I did not finish the 30-mile ride the next day because of how strong the headwinds were. So I ended up at a campsite about 20 miles up the road, which was about a 6+ hour ride. And if you can see, the grass here is horizontal. The wind's coming down so strong. And the campground I was sort of standing at the road. The campground was on the back behind me, and then the beach was in front of me. I couldn't get to the water because of how strong the wind was, between the sand whipping at me and pelting me, and just the actual act of fighting the wind to get down towards the water. It was too far. It probably wasn't any more than like 30 or 40 meters, but it was just that hard to fight the wind. Like the telephone poles up here are staked out with about like 8 to 16 guy lines. And the people who live here tell me that the poles fall down all the time because of how strong the winds are. So I stayed here for a couple days, just waiting out the storm. There was no point in riding through it. So this was a view from my cabin at 2 a.m. and it's just bright out like all the time. And I thought it'd be weird, but it really wasn't. Like, I'm not a morning person, so it meant that I could sleep until noon and ride my bike until like 2 a.m. or whatever I felt like doing, and it really wasn't, there was no problem. So I just generally rode when the weather was bad and then camped when the weather was nice. So this is the beach after the storm. You can see the wind's coming from the north, and you can see the north side of the rocks, and the sand dunes and everything is completely exposed. The dunes are the only dunes that still exist here are like where it's been stabilized with grass, and all the other sand's been blown down the beach. So I finally took the ferry off of the islands, off the Lofoten Islands. This first one, Senja, is actually still like a pretty large island, but it's not considered part of the Lofotens there. So this part of the trip, I really wasn't sure what I was going to do. Like, my rough plan was to go to Nordkapp, which is the northernmost point in Europe. I didn't have a real reason to go there. Like, I wasn't racing across Europe or, from the northernmost to southernmost points. Some other cyclists had told me that up north, if you don't get a good weather window, like, you're just going to be sitting in 40, 50-mile-per-hour winds. And I'd done one short day of riding in 30-mile-per-hour winds, and I was like, it did not sound appealing. So I had some friends that I was maybe going to meet in Tromsø, like, maybe 2 weeks later. So I wasn't really sure what to do. Thankfully, the weather was nice, so I had some time to kind of figure this out. So this is me getting on the ferry to get off the Lofoten Islands. And like I said, there are a lot of ferries in Norway. I have no idea how many I took, but there were days when I took 3 or 4 ferry rides. This is one of the longer ones. And all the ferries roughly look the same. So they have 2 ends with these open-mouthed designs. And basically on one end, it opens up, you drive your car on. At the other end, it parks on the other end of the boat, and then the mouth comes up and the cars drive off of it. So this was the start of my day. It was nice and sunny and warm. And then I get off the ferry on this island called Senja, and it was relatively warm, but you can see it's like we're not sitting in the Gulf Stream anymore. This looks much colder. And these hills and like these mountains aren't very big. Like, it's no more than 1,500 feet above sea level. And this is the middle of June, and there's still plenty of snow up here. So I looked at the route profile, and it said that it was like an 8 or 9% climb. It was steep and long enough that I was hoping there was a tunnel, but shallow enough that I kind of thought that there might not be one. So I'm climbing up this hill, and it's getting really cold, but I'm working really hard, and I can't stop because the road's so narrow and it's so steep that I know that if I stop, I won't really be able to start my bike again. So the whole time I'm in Norway, you're climbing, you're in the rain, you're in the sun, it's hot, it's cold. You can't let yourself get wet. So you can't sweat, and you can't allow yourself to get soaked by the rain. Otherwise, you risk hypothermia when you stop, or when you camp, or when you're going down the hill. So this particular hill, I was really struggling with moisture management because it was raining, it was freezing cold, I was working super hard, I was trying to wear my waterproofs, but then it would stop raining. This particular hill was like really tricky from that perspective. And it just felt like it was getting cold, and I couldn't figure out if I was particularly hungry and that's why I felt cold. I didn't know what was happening. So I get to the top, which is maybe like 800 feet above sea level, in the middle of June, and the lake is completely frozen. So I felt a little bit better about the cold thing, because it definitely was around freezing here. Thankfully, I didn't have to continue up the rest of this mountain. There was a tunnel at the top, but it was a long climb to get to the tunnel. Unfortunately, I get through the tunnel, and it's raining on the other side, and it's still hovering around freezing, and I have a long windy descent into the foggy fjord. So at this point, I decided to stop and have a snack, even though it's raining, because I need to be alert enough to descend a heavy bike down a twisty, windy road in the fog where it's close to freezing. I get to the bottom, and I realize it's about to clear up, so I find a place to camp and set up. And as I'm setting my camp up, the fog lifts, the clouds kind of go away, and this rainbow comes out over the fjord. And as I said, like, you tend to forget about the rain as soon as the sun comes out. And once I saw this rainbow and felt the sun on my skin, I sort of forgot how much work and struggle and how miserable my life had been for the 4 hours prior to this. And that was pretty much that day sort of encapsulates what everything in Norway was like. It's like a lot of struggle, a lot of trying to figure out how to not kill yourself. And then your reward at the end of the day is that, like, you get this beautiful, you're in this beautiful place and no one is there to bother you. After this, that was sort of the last rain of the trip. The sun came out after that, and while I was waiting to figure out what my friends were doing and where I was going to be going, I got to this beach and I just hung out there. And to give you an idea of how weak the sun is, this is the middle of June, and I went sunbathing at noon and barely got sunburned without sunscreen. So I sort of love the Arctic for this reason. Like, the angle of the sun is just so low that it's warm and it makes you feel great and it doesn't kill you. So at this point, my friend told me when he was going to be in Tromsø, and timing wise, it was like perfect for me to go to Nordkapp. So I looked at the weather report for the ride up to Nordkapp, and it was about the best conditions that I could have possibly asked for. So I decided at this point that this was a good reason to just do it. So I got on my bike at like 7 o'clock at night, rode for the next 5 or 6 hours, and then just kind of kept booking it towards the Cape. For some perspective on what a really, really good weather window looks like, I was expecting 6 to 8 mile per hour headwinds and like 35 to 45 degree temperatures every day, but no rain and no like strong gusts of wind. So Alta is like the northernmost city in Europe, in Norway. It's a small kind of like university town, but after this is sort of like when you really start getting into what it's more traditionally thought of as the Arctic. Like at this point, I'm probably about 70 degrees north, like 69, 70 degrees north. So it's really far north, but and because of that warmth coming off the Gulf Stream, it doesn't feel like you're sitting in the middle of the Arctic. This was kind of a typical meal that I had. I have toast with yogurt and lox, a liter of milk, apples, cheese. I'd often have like bread and brown cheese, which is like a Norwegian dessert type of cheese. It's sort of caramely flavored. Again, like people say like Norway is super expensive, but again, a lot of groceries actually are like were quite cheap. Like lox, because there's so much, the salmon fisheries in Norway are so robust. I could get like 200 grams of lox for like $4 or $5. So I just ate a lot of fish while I was up there. And because it was rarely warmer than 50 degrees, I had no issues with refrigeration. So I would just buy milk and cheese and whatever else I felt like, and not worry about it spoiling. So I finally started getting into like what I felt was more like the Arctic. You know, there were no more sheep. The primary herding animal here were reindeer. And you can see my first reindeer sighting is that bottom left picture. Or not my first sighting, but the first like roadside sighting. And they're just reindeer like everywhere up here. They just run free. I sort of expected them to be a little bit more, I guess, like graceful or something, like the way that you'd see deer, like you see it and it's really quiet and it just bounce away. But reindeer don't have predators up here, and they're really designed to be on the snow. So they're like really loud and really gangly, and they just are all over the place and do not care about anything. So the Arctic has three, or Finnmark, which is the northernmost state in Europe, in Norway, has three distinct climate zones here. There's like a coastal, an interior, and like a kind of tundra type of climate. And the annual temperature range here is 150 degree swing from from minus 60 in the winter to positive 90 degrees in the summertime. So this is the largest annual temperature swing anywhere in Europe. And because the Arctic experiences these huge temperature swings, it's one kind of theory as to why some animals kind of like became marine animals, because it's actually, the marine climate up there is actually much, much more stable than the terrestrial climate. There's still some trees here, but for the most part, it's pretty open, flat, exposed. And that's why it gets so windy, because the winds come from the north, and there's absolutely nothing stopping them for several degrees of latitude. So one night I came down from that hill covered in snow, and I camped alongside the fjord. And there are only a few places that have like really easy access to the water like this. So around 3 in the morning, I heard a reindeer come down and decide to get a drink. And they're just walking around. Again, like I said, they're super, super loud. So they woke me up. They did not care that I was there at all. They were just walking around, and some like kind of came and poked around, but most of them were just, they'd run down the hill, and like it sounds like thunder coming down the hill because they're so loud and ungainly. And I climbed back up to the plateau, and like I said, it's just big and empty here. They're, again, like 6 to 8 mile per hour headwinds were really the best conditions I could have asked for in this kind of an empty space. But there's always a house. And I ran into a cyclist who told me that basically it's so difficult to build here, between the mountains and the weather and everything else, that the Norwegian government only bothers to build houses or they only bother to build roads where like people live, basically. So there are all these really random roads kind of into the middle of nowhere, but there's always people living on them. The water up here is so clean that I drank it unfiltered a few times. If you have a filter, you should definitely filter it, but again, there's not really much contaminating the water. There's also not a whole lot to look at. So if you're really into like flowers or like big fauna or anything, you're not going to find it. But if you like rocks, like this is a really cool place to be. The the northern part of Europe, the ice only receded about 11,000 years ago from the last ice age, and the land is still recovering here. So there's not a really good layer of topsoil, not much vegetation. Because of that, not much vegetation can really like dig, really establish root here. But the rocks there's like tons of deposits and rocks. So there's like these kind of perfect layers. Some of the rock formations I saw honestly looked almost like construction sites, just how sharp the edges were and how crisp the layers of sediment were in there. And it's huge. I don't know that much about rocks, but it's a really fun place to be if you enjoy looking at cool rock formations. So then again, like it's super exposed up here. So this was like the best campsite I could have possibly asked for, because we're facing north here. So the wind is coming north and basically rising over my tent. Yeah, this is like what shelter in a really like a protected spot up in the Arctic plateau looks like. So my last day of riding up to the Cape, I technically had to get to another island. So the tunnel on the left here is where I crossed over. This is a 7-kilometer long tunnel. It is 212 meters down over 3K, and then a 4K climb back up to sea level. And the thing about riding in a tunnel is that you don't have any visual landmarks as to like what your actual pitch is. So all you really know is that you're going downhill because you're going really, really fast, and you can feel that you're going faster. And then at some point you just feel yourself going slower, and you know that you must be going uphill. I have no idea what I was doing while I was in that tunnel. It was just a long, long climb out of there. The tunnels, for emergency reasons, are marked. The distance to either exit's marked like at pretty regular intervals along the tunnel. So I was never particularly concerned like how much longer do I have here. And there are kind of emergency pullouts, so I could stop, take a break, like have a snack. But it was a very weird experience. I don't know that I'd necessarily do it again, but if you ever have an opportunity to take a long bike ride up or downhill inside a tunnel, you should do it, because it's really disorienting. So anyways, I get to the island, and I didn't realize that there were 2 major climbs, because I knew I only had 1 day of riding ahead of me, and I just didn't bother to look at the elevation profile, because why would I at this point? I had to ride no matter what it looked like. So I climbed up the hill and then kind of up to the side of this little fjord here, and there's just another herd of reindeer down the bottom, because there's always a herd of reindeer. And then you went back down and then had to climb up to this second fjord. And there's a bunch of hang gliders here trying to fly. It didn't work very well. The winds weren't cooperating for them. But you can see like the clouds are starting to come in, and it did rain like it did rain for like the last 20 minutes of my ride, which seemed kind of a fitting way to end my ride in Norway, was like in the rain and the fog and uphill. It was pretty much what I expected. So I got to Nordkapp on the solstice. So this is like the highest the sun is going to be in the sky. And you can see it's up on a cliff here. There's nothing after this. There's some islands farther north, but pretty much the next land mass is going to be, I don't know, Canada, I guess, Russia maybe, like something on the other side of the globe. When I got there, I had been kind of leapfrogging with some French cyclists on the last climb up to the visitor center here. And we got there, and there were a ton of bikes and a bunch of spandex clad cyclists in the visitor center. And I talked to the French guys, and like they hadn't seen anyone riding up there. I hadn't seen anyone riding up there. So we weren't really sure what was going on, because the bikes were much more heavily loaded than they should have been if this was just a day ride. But they were nowhere heavily loaded enough to like successfully survive in Norway. So we weren't really sure what was going on. So I I pulled one of one of the spandex clad cyclists aside and asked him what was going on. And this was the midnight start to the Nordkapp Tarifa bike packing race, where they race from the northernmost point in Europe to the southernmost point in Europe in southern Spain. And that's why they had so much stuff, but like we're still very lightly packed because these guys are covering like a couple 100 miles a day, like for a few weeks. The winner covered it in about 3 weeks' time. And they go over the Alps, the Pyrenees, I think. They go through a couple of major mountain regions. Like these guys, this is the midnight rollout. So this is the sunlight at midnight up there. And the lead guys here will be out of Finland within 2 or 3 days. They're like south of Finland after 2 or 3 days. So I took the bus back to Tromsø to meet a friend of mine. And the reason my friend was in Tromsø was because he's filming a documentary about sweat bathing around the world. So we went out on this boat. It's an old Norwegian fishing boat that's been converted to a mobile spa. So their primary business is actually for backcountry skiing. So they take people out on the boat. They kind of sail down the fjords till they find a ski line they like. Then people get off the boat, climb the mountains, ski back down to the bottom, hop back on the boat, and then they can sit in the sauna the whole ride back to town. So, and this is the view from the sauna with like this giant picture window there. Now the thing is, like I said, it was when I was up at Nordkapp, the temperature range was like 35 to 45 degrees, and in Tromsø it was a little bit warmer because it was farther south, but summer had also kind of like just started in the day or two that I got there. So the temps were in like high 50s, maybe 60. And so I was like quite warm because I had been used to being in these 30-degree temps. The locals were pretty warm because for the same reason. But remember, this is the end of June. And Oslo's in the middle of a heat wave. It's in the upper 90s in Oslo. So Mikkel's crew, his camera crew, had just flown up from Oslo that morning. And for them, this is like 40 degrees colder than it was for them in the morning. So they're in like their full winter gear here. And I'm in a tank top and shorts and just put her jacket on because it had started raining a little bit. So that was like kind of a nice way to end Norway there. After Norway, I took the bus back down to the Arctic Circle in Finland. I was just a little bit shorter on time, and I'd been riding kind of in the Arctic plateau up there. It's like known as Lapland. So everything up in the northern part of Finland there is Lapland. And I took the bus to a city called Rovaniemi, which is right on the Arctic Circle. So that northernmost point in Finland is the Arctic Circle. So you can kind of see how much time I spent above that circle when I was in Norway. Rovaniemi is the capital of Finnish Lapland, and it's also the home of Santa Claus, apparently. Like, for whatever reason, they seem to officially have title to the fact that it's Santa Claus's house. So from there, I rode south along the coast, and there's a little gap because I took the bottom coast there is just like much more urban. So I chose to spend more time in the woods, and then took the bus through the urban areas into Helsinki. So after Norway, Finland was like vacation. This is pretty much what it looked like all the time. It was sunny and warm. There was no wind. If there was wind, it was at my back, and there was pretty much no rain. The only real problem in Finland that I'm sure Jason knows exactly what this is are the mosquitoes. And fortunately for me, it was one of the better mosquito seasons that they've had. There were a lot of mosquitoes, but there was only one wave of them. So after that like couple week period where the mosquitoes were out in full force, they were just dead for the rest of the season, apparently. So the mosquitoes seem to only really like to be in the woods themselves. So what I would try to do is camp right at the edge of a recently cleared patch of like lumber area. And I'd string up my hammock with bug net like right on the edge. I'd eat and pee and everything like in this open clearing because then there's nobody around, so like it doesn't really matter. I'd wear gloves. I'd have my buff. I'd have a hat covering my forehead also, and then I'd like race into my hammock and close the bug net as quickly as possible. But these mosquitoes aren't quite like the ones that you have like in Massachusetts. They're not tiny little ones that are like really hard to catch. They're huge, and they're actually really easy to kill. There are just so many of them that it is just really hard to kill all of them. So when I close my bug net, there would inevitably be mosquitoes inside the net with me. And as a result of this, my hammock is actually kind of covered in blood stains from the number of mosquitoes that I ended up killing inside my hammock. So I went south along the coast. I was inland, so I followed the river out to the coast and then headed south. So this is a sauna in the river in Oulu, which is fairly far north in Finland, but it's well below the Arctic Circle, but this is actually climatically quite similar to northern Norway, whereas sort of in the Arctic there. And that's partly just because it's inland, it has more of a continental climate, any of those moderating effects from the ocean. And this sauna is seasonal, so they bring it in the wintertime so it doesn't freeze, but you basically come out on this little platform, they'll pull you in, pull you back to shore. You go in the sauna. When you're too hot, you go jump in the river and cool off. There's a little deck. You can see this guy on the right is sitting. You go out, you have a beer, you hop in the sauna, come back out. You can just spend the day there. This is a public sauna. It costs €5. You get access to a locker, a sauna, everything in there, a shower. So this is kind of a pretty popular thing in Finland. And then as I rode south, I decided I wanted to check out the beaches. Like I hadn't been to the beach for a while. And the beaches here they don't really feel like the beach. It sort of feels like there's just a body of water in the middle of the country. And what's actually happening here is, like I had mentioned, the ice receded only about 11,000 years ago. And the weight of the ice from the sheets before is so heavy that the ground itself actually compresses, like the rock compresses under the weight of the ice. And as the ice retreats, the weight is released and the ground starts to rebound and decompress. And what's happening in Scandinavia right now is that the ground is still decompressing from the most recent ice age. So as the ground rises, the level actually comes up and the water level drops. So shipping in the area between Sweden and Finland is actually pretty difficult because new little islands pop up all the time as the water, basically as the water level drops. And even accounting for current sea level rise, it's expected that the water border between Finland and Sweden will disappear within 1,000 years. It's rising at about 1 centimeter a year, which is a lot geologically. And that amount of rebound is enough to basically add a new plot of land along the coast of Finland every generation. So if you have a house on the coast, like your kids will have a full plot of land in front of you between your house and the water to build another house. And because of that, like it doesn't have the same feel as like a true continental edge type of beach like we'd have in California or even in Norway over there. So I went to this town and I stayed with the Warm Showers host, and so this is where like I really kind of began to see how this land decompression actually affects society there. So she lived in a house that was from, I think, the 1600s, and it was about 6 miles inland, and that was the old shoreline. She lived at the old harbor, and in the last 400 years, the new harbor is now 6 miles farther away. You actually have to go on a causeway to go out to the harbor because basically they were sick of having to keep moving the harbor. So they built the harbor itself quite a ways kind of into the water so that as the land rose, it would eventually meet the harbor. So she took me to her sauna club. It's called the Penguin Swim Club, but it's pretty much just a sauna and a dock that goes into the harbor. And The dock itself is heated so that in the wintertime you can walk out there and there's no ice on there, so you don't run the risk of slipping and falling and hurting yourself. I kind of continued south through the archipelago, and this is what it all kind of looks like. It's like all these islands. It really, to me, looked more like a drowned landscape rather than kind of like a true coastal environment. And that's because, I mean, that's basically what it is the land is coming up. These new little islands are popping up all the time. You know, eventually whatever this grass is growing in will be proper land, and this will be pushed farther out. Fortunately, by the time it was blueberry season, the mosquitoes had gone away. So I was camped out in the forest here, and I would just hang my hammock, and because I didn't need my bug net anymore, I could just roll out my hammock, grab a handful of blueberries, eat. When I ate all the blueberries within an arm's reach of my hammock, I had to get up. But I was eating a couple liters of blueberries a day at this point, and they were really, really delicious. So that was definitely my primary food source for about a week. In Finland and Norway, in the Scandinavian countries, they have what's called the right to roam. So you're legally allowed to camp anywhere, to cross land, private property, to forage. And as long as you're not like picking, like if I walked into a blueberry farm and started picking blueberries, it's not, that would be considered theft. But walking through a privately owned forest and picking blueberries along the way is completely within my right to do. So I did that a lot, and my hand was permanently stained for about a week. And then eventually I got to Helsinki, and the primary thing I wanted to do in Helsinki was go check out a bunch of saunas. And fortunately, I had a little bit of a plan. And the first sauna that I went to when I got there, I met some locals who then told me they'd kind of show me some other places around the city. So I had a pretty good tour of saunas in Helsinki. The two that I picked here, I thought were kind of interesting ones. So the sauna that's on the right here is the Old City Sauna. It's the oldest public sauna in Helsinki, and it's basically like a giant room for men, a giant room for women, and a locker room that goes with that. And there's no water to jump in here, so when people get hot, they come out the front door and they just sit in the park here. This is true no matter the time of year. So in the wintertime, when it's like minus 30 degrees out, if you're hot from the sauna, you go outside and you sit in the park basically naked and just kind of let the steam come off of you. So people say like you'll see people in their full-on winter parkas sitting next to people who are basically naked in the park in minus 30 degrees snow. And then you come over to the picture on the left, which is the Sampa sauna, which is the newest public sauna in Helsinki. And Helsinki is like getting very popular. Like most places in the world, a lot of people, there's a big rush from the more rural countryside communities into metropolitan areas. So Helsinki has been trying to build more land in order to put more houses in. So this is a spit of landfill. And what the guy who was showing me this sauna told me is that the developers will build houses at the closest to the old landline and sell it as like, beautiful harbor view property. And then as soon as they sell, they'll build another development right in front of that and sell it as beautiful harbor view property and continue until they eventually reach the end of the landfill. So several years ago, there's like this kind of idea that public and private land is for everyone's use unless explicitly said otherwise. So some people decided to go build a sauna at the end of this spit of landfill, which this one is like a construction site. So in order to get there, you have to ride through a construction site to the very end, and then you get the sauna. Now, the thing here is that the city, because this is Finland and this is viewed as an enterprising thing to do, the city pretty much sanctioned it. It's still technically like not a real thing, but I think like the president of Finland has been there before, like the mayor of Helsinki goes there on a semi-regular basis. So like it's definitely, it's not really in any danger of being shut down. But it's completely volunteer run. So people bring the water out there, they build the saunas, they bring fire and split logs. And because of it, like it's sort of open for anyone to go. So yeah, the saunas, you just kind of, you meet anyone in there. And it's just like a very, very nice place to be. Obviously, I like saunas. Gretchen knows how much I like my saunas. So it's like, but it's an interesting thing culturally, because like when I was in one sauna, we laughed and people were like, did you know who that was in the sauna? And I was like, no. And they're like, it was like the biggest rock star in Finland or something. I don't know. It was like, so it's just the type of thing, like everyone goes to the public sauna, everyone knows everyone. And that's kind of a very leveling feature of society. So it was like a nice way to kind of end that trip. And then I came back to the States, and it was just much louder than it was in Finland. And yeah, you didn't have quite the same, there are no saunas the same way. So I was very happy when I went back to my sauna in San Francisco. But yeah, so that's all that I have. Does anyone have questions?
So I have a question.
Yeah.
Maggie. Great job.
Thanks.
Love that you ended on saunas, since we haven't
I know.
had one in so long.
this to be fair, this deck was originally put together for a presentation at the Dolphin Club, so which is why it's really like swim, water, sauna heavy. But yeah, that's mostly what the trip was, anyways.
Awesome. My question was more scientific, but you can answer in a general way.
Yeah.
So, can you explain a little bit more how sea level is rising, and that is that rising slower in this part of the world?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is.
In the
rising.
land?
It's rising. Yeah, it's still rising slower than the land is rising. I think parts of Alaska have a similar phenomenon going on right now, where they're actually experiencing net sea level loss, but it's still, the sea is still rising. It's just that the land is going faster than the sea is.
And is it because it's thawing out?
No, basically, like, when you had like if you were standing on a sponge and then you step off the sponge, it doesn't rebound right away. It takes like a minute for the sponge to kind of come back up. And the same thing happens with the rock. Like, we don't really think of rock as being compressible, but when it's under that much pressure, it is compressible. So the ice retreated.
So it's the rock, not the sediment?
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, I think at this point it's pretty much all, the sediment becomes sedimentary rock because of all the pressure.
Okay, got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah.
I'm not a geologist, but so I guess the other question I had was I could have sworn I saw tiny little flowers all over the place, but
yes. Yeah. So yeah.
There were some flowers, right?
Yeah. Gretchen's an ecologist.
And a botanist.
Yeah.
They're just really small, right?
Yeah, exactly. Nothing really grows tall. And you would know this better. I have read a couple things that suggest it's not necessarily a function of like the topsoil. It's sometimes like actually just, it's really difficult to grow that tall, and like the energy so the plants just like energetically are better staying closer to the ground.
And the fact that the growing season is so short.
Yeah. And that's why the berries are actually really sweet. They're like really, really sweet because the sugars are so concentrated up there because there's such a short, intense growing season, where it's just like a month of direct sunlight and then nothing after that. So the sugars are very concentrated in the fruit there.
How tall are the blueberry bushes? Are they bushes, or are they like,
they're little
prostrate?
Bushes. They're maybe like a foot tall. They're not very tall. Yeah. Yeah, which is why it was nice to just like hang the hammock and not have to bend over or anything. You just grab it.
Thanks.
Very convenient. Yeah. Any other questions?
No. Well, the other thing I was going to say, I'm a wetland ecologist, so a lot of those pictures were, at least in the last like 10 or 15 slides before the saunas.
Yeah.
Those are all wetlands, right? So
pretty much, yeah.
This part of the world has a really high aerial cover of wetlands, which are important for a lot of different species. So it's pretty neat to see all that. Although they're probably almost frozen a lot of the year.
Probably, yeah.
When you were there.
Yeah.
That's neat.
Maggie, how much weight were you riding with, and how many miles did you put on?
Oh, that's a good question. I should know how many miles I did. I can look that one up. Let's see. Is the weight I actually sent a lot of my stuff back. I kind of had this idea that I was going to do some like pack rafting and stuff when I was in Finland with all the waterways. But the hills were just so crazy in Finland or in Norway, and I was just so sick of it that I actually just sent everything back. So I don't think I was going too heavy, but it was a lot. I mean, I was carrying a full pannier of food all the time. I had all my rain gear, 2 shelters because I had a hammock and a tent shelter. So I don't know like the actual weight, but it was not a lightweight setup at all. Miles ridden.
Wow.
It's about 2,000 miles.
In how many days?
It was over about, let's see.
Days on bike.
Yeah, so 13, that doesn't actually, 31 days on and then 19 days on here.
50 days, 2,000 miles?
Total, yeah.
Yeah. I wasn't like pushing it, like mileage-wise, but Norway was I'd ride about 6 hours a day, and Norway was like kind of working for 6 hours, whereas Finland was like having a nice pleasure ride for 6 hours. Yeah.
Remind me what is considered the latitude of the Arctic Circle. Where did you encounter
66.5 degrees.
Okay. So just in the top ones, the Nordkapp and Santasville.
Yeah. Finland like was really, I came right to the Arctic Circle and then headed south from there.
Right. Okay.
Even though like up above that, like in what's considered Lapland, it is like technically Norway and Sweden and Finland and Russia, but the local people there, like the indigenous people there, the Sami, have their own Sami Congress up there. So it is technically 4 separate countries, but it is more like it's Lapland, and the people who live there are the Sami, and it's much more homogenous culturally up there, despite the international borders.
How easy was it to speak English then?
Like really easy. Pretty much everyone spoke English.
Okay.
And actually, when I was in the sauna, people would be speaking Finnish, and then they like turn to me and clearly expect me to say something. And I just be like, oh, sorry, I don't speak Finnish. And then they just immediately switch to English and like continue having all their conversations in English. Even though like they weren't my friends, I didn't know them, but it was like important to them that like everyone there be included. Even though the Finns didn't always speak the best English, it was still like, because it was better than my Finnish, they like always do that to accommodate me, which, you know, I didn't ask for, but I thought it was like very telling about kind of the culture in the sauna there.
Maggie, how did it compare to Iceland?
Well, so I was only in Iceland for a couple of days, a couple of years ago in late fall, like a very different time of year. Iceland's a lot farther south. So Iceland's entirely south of the Arctic Circle. But it's a volcanic island. It's not a volcanic island, but it is kind of a volcanic island. It's just a very weird, it has a lot of other weird stuff. It's not like Hawaii, that's a volcanic island. It's a little different, but it's a very geothermically active island. So Iceland, you sort of have like the exterior is where people are, and the interior is completely empty. Like people do not live in the interior of Iceland, whereas Norway and Finland and everything, people do live everywhere around there. That's probably the biggest difference. Like from a cultural perspective, everything in Iceland is coastal.
Is that because it's so steep in Iceland, or?
It's just the weather is so crazy. Like there's a giant volcano there, there's hot springs, there's like all sorts of crazy stuff going on in the middle of Iceland, and it's just safer. Nothing's growing there either, or there's no real reliable food source because other animals don't live there either.
No reindeer.
Yeah, no reindeer. But yeah, cool.
Did you eat the cod? Did you like that?
Yeah, I wasn't like as crazy about it. It wasn't bad, but it's just kind of like really dry and kind of stringy. I was like, it's just, and it's like dried salted fish. It was whatever. The fish in general was like really good though. So
could you get it fresh though in the
yeah,
cities?
the fresh stuff was really good.
Okay.
Like really,
What
really good.
what other cuisine? Like what else do they eat besides?
There's whale.
Fish?
I didn't have any whale, but whale meat was like black. It was kind of interesting looking. The chef who was on the boat, the chef that I met when I was with Mikkel in Tromsø, had gone out seal hunt. He was very into like locally sourced food, so he had been seal hunting, and he told me a place where I could go get seal, which he said was like a very good place to get seal, but they were closed for like a week or something when I was there, so I didn't go. Which I was like a little conflicted on because like I work for like a seal
conservationist, right?
Like I literally like picked up a newborn harbor seal yesterday to go bring it to the hospital. So I was a little conflicted on that one, but I think I would have tried it. But yeah, I didn't eat anything like particularly questionable there.
Do they get vegetables or
like
everything
some
meat?
root vegetables, but a lot of potatoes.
Mm-hmm.
That's like in Finland, especially because Finland has a history of being a very poor country. Like basically the joke there is that like every meal is just potatoes, one way or another. So like most, poor European countries, it's just a lot of potato type of dishes. But Finland really only came into some wealth in the last like 2 decades. So it's like still very, very recent.
Mm-hmm.
Now you mentioned that Norway made their money with the North Sea oil.
Mm-hmm.
Finland have reserves also?
No. So Finland is like super poor. So Finland is like has been invaded by a lot of countries like Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Russia for most of its history. And they finally declared independence in like the 19 teens and then were promptly invaded by Russia and lost a lot of, that was like the Winter War, which is Finland's like biggest military victory, which was still a loss, but they held the Russian army at bay for a while. And that's when the Finnish army really got a reputation for good like tactical warfare, like working in wintertime and skiing and using their knowledge of the snow and winter to kind of outsmart the Russians. But then eventually winter ended and the giant Russian army could overtake the Finns. So they lost a lot of territory and money. And then after World War II, the Finns had kind of the Finns decided with whoever was not going to attack them, basically. And because of it, they ended on the wrong side of the war. And they were actually the only country to pay their war reparations in full. And in addition to actually paying all of their war reparations, they didn't take any Marshall Plan money, which was partly because, or not partly, it was entirely because they didn't want, the conditions for taking Marshall Plan money is that the US can establish military bases on your soil. And being so close to Russia and having such a long history of being invaded by Russia, they didn't want American military bases in Finland. So they were very, very poor for a long time. And it's really been in like the tech boom, basically, that because they have a very well-educated workforce, that they finally have kind of gotten their economy going again.
Wow.
So is the economy mainly tech-based then?
There's a lot. I mean, it's lumber. Like lumber is the biggest export from Finland. It's all trees, but yeah, like the knowledge economy is growing there, and that's really what's contributing to the like, growth and future development of the Finnish economy. Like Nokia is the biggest corporation in Finland, and they've been around actually for like 150 years. They're not like a tech company. They're like a major conglomerate that transitioned into tech.
How's coronavirus in that part of the world?
I don't know. Probably not as bad as it is here because people are pretty willing to be like, yeah, sure, we'll stay home. There's a lot of like Finnish memes on the internet right now that's like before coronavirus of like everyone just being completely apart from each other, and they're like post coronavirus, everyone still stays apart from each other.
That's funny.
So yeah, these countries definitely practice social distancing on a very regular basis. So
that same joke is traveling around Minnesota too.
well, yeah, because you have all like similar culturally too. Yeah, it's kind of crazy.
Well, good thing that you did this last year, not this summer.
It was really good training for this, just like being by myself in miserable conditions, eating the same thing over and over again. So yeah, kind of perfect.
What is this blog site? This is neat.
Oh, this is like my travel blog.
So this is an Excel spreadsheet you imported, or?
Basically, most of it's like actually like travel essays, but then I'd been asked the questions like this enough, like how many miles did you ride and all this stuff. So I actually just put it in here so that I could find it later on when asked.
Just a lot of time to put all that together.
Yeah, I had a lot of time on my hands for
Is it all downloaded from your Garmin then, or?
I mean, a lot was like the mileage and stuff was from my Garmin, but like expenses and stuff I just kept in my notebook.
Right.
What about elevation gain? That would have been a hard one unless you had it done
that's
electronically. Okay.
Yeah, that's Garmin. All the like kind of riding stats are Garmin based. Everything else is my notes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't spend much money, that's for sure.
Yeah. This is like the most expensive place you could possibly go bike touring. So it's a good way to live cheap.
How long was it? Like a month or more?
Like 2.5 months.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I was gone for 10 weeks. So.
But didn't you go to a wedding or something at the end? Or I can't remember.
Yeah.
Was that different?
Yeah. In Missouri though. The wedding was in Missouri.
Oh, that's right. Okay. So so you were there for 10 weeks. Wow.
Yeah. And then I was still gone from San Francisco for another month after that.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Yeah, you probably spent that much money on your plane ticket plus the wedding.
Yeah. Yeah, Missouri was much more expensive and much hotter. And yeah, Missouri was a very different ride. It was like 105 degrees when I was in Missouri. It was not pleasant.
Did you do any surfing in Norway?
No. One of the guys I met there did tell me he'd let me borrow a board, but it's just hard getting in water that cold when you don't have a place to go warm up. Like it's just being in like 45-degree water and then knowing that you have to come out and warm yourself up is like a very not pleasant thought.
And you didn't have a wetsuit.
Right.
You gotta have a wetsuit for surfing.
Yeah. Like I could have borrowed someone else's, but it's not going to fit that well. So yeah, not the best.
Oh, I had a question. How much, yeah, you do say how much ferries were, but how much were they on average, like each one?
So actually farther up north, they didn't charge bikes for ferries at all.
Wow.
And then farther south, I'd say like a couple dollars each. Yeah. And there's no real like way to avoid them either. It's like days of riding or like $2 to cross the fjord in 10 minutes. So.
Is it similar like the Seattle area and the islands there, or the ferries?
Yeah. I think it's actually similar. Yeah. Cause that whole like British Columbia area is actually very similar. It's glacially carved. It's very similar geologically.
Is like one company running the ferries, or they have a whole series of like?
It's all government run.
Okay.
Like everything in Norway is government run, basically. They have so much money, and things just like work really well. And it's, yeah, I wouldn't say it's like exactly like socialist paradise because they actually have some really interesting takes on things like conservation. Like they're very into conservation and like making sure that Norway stays pristine, but like not necessarily like what that means is like they'll just offshore their like certain processes. So like they don't get the like the factories in Norway stinking up the air there, but they'll just buy a factory somewhere else, like in Denmark, and use that and just export the goods or import the goods. So, and like there's a pack of wolves that roams Northern Europe, and the general consensus everywhere in Europe is that the wolves need to be protected, and governments just compensate farmers for whatever livestock that the wolves kill, except in Norway where they're like, cool, it's fine, just shoot the wolves. So it's an interesting thing. I think it's a very, I didn't get a good handle on it, but it's not as clear. Like they're super environmentalist, they're super conservationist or whatever. Like it's a very kind of distinctive Norwegian approach to like conservation.
Non-conservation.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an opinion that can only be had by a country that has like $1 trillion wealth fund, and very few people to spend that money on. But
what's the population of those?
Like 5-6 million, something like that. I think it's about the same as what like Massachusetts. So it's in like Norway, especially, is a very big country. Population density here is like next to nothing. And almost all the population is centered within 2 or 3 cities in all of these countries. So the non-urban areas are very sparse.
Do they have to pay for university?
No.
Yet? No. Neither Finland or?
You get paid to go to university.
Yeah. Undergrad? I doubt it.
Maybe not undergrad, but they get
undergrad.
But everything is pretty much free. Like
that's how it used to be in all of Europe.
Yeah, they're the Scandinavian countries are the last holdouts from that kind of old European model, and then and then Finland teaches a lot of courses in English just to try to bolster it. But again, this is Finland back in like the 60s, knew that they needed to do something to really boost their economy, and what they decided to do was invest heavily in maternal and infant health, which is why Finland was one of the first countries to achieve like a really absurdly low infant mortality rate, and education. So between those two things, they basically said, let's make sure that like our population is healthy and well cared for, and that they are given the tools to like do well and earn money in life. And it's really starting to pay off for them now.
Great.
Yeah. So yeah, cool. Well, thank you guys for coming. I have to go hop on another call, but
so do I.
Yep.
This is fun.
Yeah. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for sharing.
Cool. I'll see you guys later.
Super cool info, Maggie. We'll talk again.
Yeah, definitely. I'm glad you can make it this time.
Yeah.
Cool. I'll talk to you all later.
Take care, man.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
How do I turn this off here?